Welcome back to the podcast from Responsible Raw Materials, where we explore the people and perspectives shaping what responsible raw materials really look like in practice. Today, I'm joined by the wonderful John Thompson, a geologist, explorer, teacher, mentor, and someone who's spent his career moving between industry, academia, technology, and innovation. And if you listened to our previous episode with Anne Thompson, you'll already know that Anne and John have shared an extraordinary journey together over many decades. They've lived and worked across continents, built careers alongside one another, and have both helped to shape the economic geology profession in their own distinctive ways. Today's episode gives us the opportunity to hear John's side of that story. What I particularly enjoyed about this conversation is that John has never really been interested in staying in one lane. Instead, he has spent his career moving between different worlds, bringing ideas from one into another, and asking questions that don't always have obvious answers. We talk about exploration in Norway and Australia, building bridges between industry and academia, working with mining companies, technology startups, and entrepreneurs, and why some of the most exciting innovations happen when people from completely different disciplines start working together. But we also talk about leadership, not leadership through hierarchy, but leadership through influence, building trust, connecting people, and creating opportunities for others, and recognizing that the best solutions often come from bringing together people with different perspectives. And finally, we look ahead. How do we solve some of the biggest challenges facing the raw materials sector? How do we rethink waste? And how do we unlock entirely new ways of recovering resources? And how do we create environments where the next generation can tackle problems our generation hasn't yet solved? Yes, it's a conversation about geology, but it's also about curiosity, collaboration, and the power of connecting ideas that might otherwise never meet. It's a conversation about connecting the dots. I hope you enjoy it. So I'm sitting here with the phenomenal John Thompson. John, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's John Thompson, not surprisingly. And I've been involved with earth science since I left school in England. And my career has then taken me through education and into the mining industry, and from the mining industry into academia, and back and forth between academia and industry, which is a brief summary of a lot of my life, for which I'm very grateful because I've managed to experience two different worlds. So it all began, if we
Mhm.
go back to kind of me as a young boy, when I was at school, high school, I was told I was going to be a civil engineer because I was interested in maths and science and what have you, and particularly more physics probably than chemistry, although it turned out I was better at chemistry than physics. But when it came to applying for university and I had to tick a box to say what I wanted to study potentially at university, I could not tick an engineering box, and particularly not a civil engineering box, because I just intuitively knew that it was not for me. And
So what was it? What was about that intuition? Like, was it a kind of a sort of a feeling in your skin, or what was it?
it was the realization that I'm not terribly quantitative, which for an engineer is a serious flaw. and and understanding what that meant, and I had broad interests in all sorts of things, but I like to think about them and describe them more than quantify them. And so I went immediately looking for things which were a bit more descriptive and less quantified, and hit geology. And by pure luck, it worked out. And I always wondered to this day, had I blinked and not seen geology, what would be the next thing box that I would have ticked?
Yeah. So in a parallel universe, what do you think you would have done if you hadn't gone for
Yeah,
geology?
it's a tough one. I mean, metallurgy maybe, but I think I probably would be more outside zoology or so on. But but probably that wouldn't have worked. 'Cause I'm not super comfortable with life, the squishy parts of life, so and humans or other animals. So that probably wouldn't have been. I certainly would have been a very terrible doctor, that's for sure. So anyway, yeah. So I ticked the right box, and I realized that when literally day one, first course, when the lecture started, I just was like, "Oh my goodness, this
Mhm.
is it. This is my life. I found the right place."
So where was it that you studied?
Oxford. So I was very fortunate to get into Oxford. Still don't know quite how that happened, but and I had a great misapprehension about Oxford. I thought it would be way too highfalutin, terrible, fancy people. And the first person I met when I went to Oxford was a person who's still a good friend of mine who was from Yorkshire, who had a very, very thick Yorkshire accent. I thought, "Ooh, this is cool. I like this place." So yeah, I was fine, and I was fine there, and I loved geology. There's one more probably piece to why I chose geology. Um, was my father was an archaeologist, and I spent time on digs with him around the UK, and I loved being out with him doing digs. And he had some appreciation of geology. He knew when he hit bedrock that he'd gone too far, and so that probably was in my head, even though I didn't really realize it at the time. I'm sure there was something that made me think about geology.
So what did your parents think of you going and doing geology then?
Ah, that's a great question. Not a lot. I think actually my father really approved. I don't think my mother completely approved. And I have an older sister and a younger sister. My older sister became a lawyer. My younger sister became a doctor. And I think for her, in her sort of background, upbringing, family, those careers made far more sense. She was fine with science, but that you could be a doctor, but not
Mm.
this geology thing. And yeah, I always wonder a little bit was how much did she really appreciate my father being an archaeologist, or whether that because he started actually as an economist and started his career in a bank, and very quickly realized that was not for him. So his realization that he wasn't quantitative was a bit like mine in some ways. He was far more effective in the humanities. I mean, he was a linguist and he could read Latin and Greek, things that were way, way, way beyond me.
Well, talking about what comes next
Yeah.
then. So you've now got a degree in geology from Oxford.
Yeah.
What happened next?
So my classmates at that time, so this is your mid 70s, there were two things happened to my class. Basically, there's 25 of us. Half just left geology or earth science as was, and went off into careers in all sorts of things. And did many of them did amazing jobs, incredible. And the other half stayed with earth science. Two or three went on to do PhDs. Majority went to the North Sea. So they're out on oil rigs doing petroleum geology, oil and gas and what have you. And I didn't want to do that. And so I went looking for alternatives. And so I applied to universities in Canada, Australia, US, looking for graduate master's programs with not really a very good idea of why or what. And at some point along the way, I heard about a person at the University of Toronto who'd been doing some work with a Canadian company in Italy, which happened to be the area I did my honours mapping project in, which is Cinque Terre, which is rather a nice place. And I thought, well, I wonder if I could get a master's to keep working in Cinque Terre. So I wrote to this guy, and he was a consultant actually, who did part-time teaching at the University of Toronto, and he basically said, "No, I can't take you, and no, you cannot work in you cannot work in Cinque Terre." But my colleague, Professor Nordret, has a project. He's looking for a student to work in Norway. So I thought, Mediterranean, Norway. Oh, go with Norway. So I went with Norway and started my master's working on a project in Norway with a company. So from day one, I was working with a company, which was Falconbridge in those days, on a small magmatic sulphide deposit in central Norway.
So you mentioned that a lot of your classmates went into the North Sea, into oil and gas, and you didn't want to do that. Why didn't you want to do that?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, I didn't have it wasn't driven by some fundamental concern for the world or the earth or fossil fuels, because that wasn't even in anybody's consciousness at that
Mm.
point. It was a feeling that the work would be dull. I think that's what's really bothered me. Too fixed in one place. I have a limited attention span, and I knew that back then, that sitting on an oil rig looking at chips of rock didn't seem like the best result from my earth science degree. So I think that was it. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that's a good reason. So okay, so now we're in Norway.
yeah,
We're working with Falconbridge.
yeah.
What was that like?
Fantastic. I had a brilliant time. We had a lovely time. I was working with, there was another student working there on his PhD in the region. He was from Edinburgh. So the two of us was there, and we lived in a little caravan next to a farm on a hill overlooking a valley, which was beautiful, in a small village called Kvikni. Everybody knew everybody in the village. So then we got immersed in the village, the Wednesday night dances, the whole environment, and then worked hard on the work for that summer, and then a year later back for a second summer. So it was a beautiful experience. And the thesis was kind of ho-hum in a way, because it was a very quite difficult metamorphosed rock. So I couldn't answer the fundamental questions. So I did a very descriptive kind of thesis, understanding structure and deformation, but knew that I wanted to do more. So when I finished my master's, I then decided I wanted to do a PhD, still with my supervisor in Toronto. But I then switched to the Appalachians to pursue again magmatic sulfides in an unusual environment, an environment that most people in magmatic sulfides dismissed as you don't go to ancient arcs and collisional belts to look for magmatic sulfides. You go to the rifts and you go to Sudbury and so on and so on. But I wanted to understand these unusual deposits. So I went tootling off to Maine and did my own thing, pretty much, my own thesis. And my supervisor, Tony Norwood, came down and spent some time with me. But most of the time I did it just by myself.
And how did you find that sort of, I guess, that self-sufficiency of
Yeah.
but also freedom, I guess, to work just by yourself?
Total freedom. Yeah. And I loved it. And now looking back on it, think, what on earth was I doing? For a number of reasons. One, I didn't, geologically, I was still learning. So I was probably making a lot of mistakes and doing things which not necessarily in the best way. But then from a safety perspective, having now been through industry and been totally engrossed in safety and safety culture, the number of silly things I did by myself when nobody knew where I was, I would park my car and I would walk off a mountain into a forest, and I would spend all day, and then I would reappear in the evening. Nobody knew where I was at any point in those journeys. And you think about it now, it's like, wow, it worked out fine. Fortunately, I didn't hurt myself, and the thesis worked out really well. But when I finished the thesis, that was it. I knew at that point I didn't want to be an academic. And so then I had to get a job. So funny enough, it was 1982 and it was a downturn in Canada. And although I'd actually worked already for several companies, I'd done quite a bit of work in the summers. In addition to doing my thesis work in Maine, I'd spent 2 or 3 months working for companies in different parts of Canada. So I had quite a decent amount of experience, but there was still no jobs for me. And so but I got a job in Australia. So I upped and left and went to Australia, landed in Western Australia with a company. They dumped me on a project, basically told me to get on with it. So again, it was like no choice, no introduction, review this information, tell me what's going on. And it turned out afterwards, I didn't realize at the time, it was a test. They
Mm.
wanted to see how I do it. And the person my boss at the time, was not my favorite person in the world. I'll just leave it at that. And that was the way he operated, by just trying to put pressure on people to see how they would respond. Fortunately, I survived, got through that one and continued on. And then actually had a fantastic time in Australia, both in Western Australia for 2 years and Eastern Australia for 2 years. Amazing.
So if we just let's go back to Toronto and that moment when you thought, I don't want to stay in academia, I want to go into industry. What helped you make that decision?
Um, I think I'd understood enough about academia to realize what was involved in it, and the pressure on you as a young academic to produce, which was nothing to what it is today, actually, but it was still ramping up and increasing. And the specialization. And again, I already knew enough about myself to know that my attention span was a challenge, and that I needed to have diversity and flexibility in my life. And that was, to me at that point, wasn't synonymous with academia, which is not necessarily the case, actually. But that was my view at the time, was that,
Mm.
and I needed a change of scene. Ironically, all the people I went through with as graduate students stayed pretty much in magmatic sulfides and became very good. The Steve Barnes, Sarah Jane Barnes, Peter Lightfoot, amazing icons in that world. And as I like to tell people, I fractionated and moved to more felsic environments.
That's such a geeky thing to say.
Absolutely.
And something else happened in Toronto before you moved to Australia, didn't it?
Yeah. So I happened to meet this beautiful young woman who enticed me to throw a frisbee with her, and the rest is history. Yeah. So we partnered and became, you know, clearly our plan was to be together very soon after that. And so when I moved to Australia, um, 2 to 3 weeks after I moved to Australia, I phoned her up and asked her if she'd marry me. So
And she said yes.
she said yes, which was pretty unorthodox. And then we spent a year basically apart, not seeing each other. With, in those days, very poor communication. I could spend another hour telling stories about how we communicated and did not communicate. Maybe we'll add it on at the end. But looking back on that, no internet, no direct communication. And even when we actually got together and got married a year later in Miami, Florida, which is where Anne was from, with her parents, there was a lot of trepidation on both our parts as what have we done? And fortunately, we did the right thing, and we followed through, and Anne came back to Australia, and we lived in Australia together for the next 3 years.
So you are now in exploration. And so how did exploration in Australia differ to, say, Norway, where you had previously done some exploration?
So the biggest difference was obviously it's not seasonal. It's year-round exploration. So we worked 3 weeks on, 1 week off continuously through the year. And so as opposed to this intense 2 to 3 month field season in the north of trying to get everything done, now you could spread the work out. So it was in some ways it was easier. It was more logical. You could plan things over long periods of time and so on. And the work was more spread out accordingly. So I think in some respects it was easier. The biggest challenge for me was I'd never seen a weathered rock. And so walking around on a laterite weathering surface and trying to pretend that I actually knew what was underneath it was super challenging. And I was very, very lucky. Early on in Western Australia, I ran into an American called Jack Hallberg, who was working at CSIRO in Perth and had been there for many years. And he was amazing at understanding laterite surfaces and saprolytically altered rocks. And so I managed to spend several weeks with him, just basically following him around. And as he would tell me, we're just walking over the contact from the rhyolite to the andesite, I'd be looking at this. Well, that was slightly redder and that's slightly pinker, and gradually began to understand, lateralized terrains and environments. So big learning experiences for me in Australia.
So what happened after Australia?
So Australia was a critical moment when we'd been there for 4 years. There were big changes going on in the company at that point, and they offered me a job back in England. And it was the minerals division of British Petroleum, but they didn't offer Anne a job. And so that was a kind of a big deal for us, and we agonized over that. I actually, at the same time, had a potential academic job in Canada, and so we were juggling different jobs for me, and then the lack of a job for Anne. And these were big decisions that we had to make. And in the end, we opted for going back to England. And I had this amazing job, literally running around the world doing area selection with us 2 other people. It was extraordinary. And Anne, fortunately, after 6 months of freezing in the English winter, realized this wasn't going to work, and she started consulting back to Australia. So then she was flying to Australia, I was flying to other places. Occasionally, we'd end up in the same place at the same time. Sometimes in an airport where we'd exchange bottles of duty free so that we could legitimately go through customs and things like this. But yeah, so it wasn't ideal. It wasn't perfect in many ways, but it worked for that period of time. But we very quickly realized that wasn't sustainable. And at the same time, we had thoughts of families and so on. So then a chance came up to move to the US, to move to Salt Lake and work in the sort of Utah, Nevada, Arizona area doing exploration for me. And for Anne, that was an opportunity to step back and then have our child. And then she formed her own career working out of basically creating her own company and own interests, starting in Salt Lake City.
So what were you doing in Salt Lake City?
So I was exploring for gold in northeast Nevada, so Carlin styles of gold mineralization, and then a little bit for porphyry coppers in Arizona, Utah. So again, project worked. Whereas I'd had this kind of highfalutin job out of England running all over the world, this was again now far more focused around a regional exploration program. So it was good for me. It regrounded me a little bit because much as I enjoyed the flying around seeing projects, it was very much, as somebody likes to say, a seagull, where you drop in and you're not very nice to the people you dropped in on. um, and it was good to get back and actually be grounded in terms of taking projects on and drilling and bringing them through it forward and so on, and doing a few, a little bit of research, but less research. On the research front, one of the things that I should add, because it's the context of the next thing that happened, was even through all that 10-year period of Australia, the UK, and the US, I'd kept sort of some academic interests up. I'd written up some of the papers from my PhD. I wrote a paper with others, including Anne, in Australia about the deposit we were working on. We worked together on another project in central Kalimantan and wrote a paper on that. So I'd kept sort of some academic credentials in the work, not at an academic kind of level of productivity, but still enough. And so 1990, I was sent to Vancouver to consider opening an office for the company in Vancouver and doing exploration in Western Canada. And while I was there, I heard about this group called the Mineral Deposit Research Unit that had just been formed, and they were looking for their first director. And for some reason, I thought I could do that. So I really crazy. So I applied for the job and I got the job. And so I moved at the beginning of 1991 and became the first director at the Mineral Deposit Research Unit.
So what is MDRU?
So Mineral Deposit Research Unit, MDRU, it's often confused dyslexically as MRDU by many people for some reason, partly because there was a consulting group called MRDU that existed at that time, so that didn't help. So MDRU was a an organization that was created to do collaborative research with industry and the university environment. And it was engineered in such a way that it was an entity that was semi-independent from the department and from the university, and the director was semi-independent, and so wasn't a faculty member. It was a contractual position. So it was an odd position, and that oddness was both really good because it gave us tremendous independence, and really difficult because of the relationships with existing faculty who were immensely distrustful of the secret consulting group that had been foisted on them. I was with them 7 years, and it took most of that 7 years really to build trust across the faculty to the point that they were fully engaged. By the time I left, after 7 years, they were all fully engaged and fully involved. And the new director, who was Dick Tosdell, who came in, inherited, I think, something that was easier, although it had a new set of challenges that he had to deal with, for sure.
So what kind of research did it do?
So when we started, it was focused on doing work initially in British Columbia. So it was like to focus on British Columbia and maybe sneak over the border into the Yukon, but don't go too far. It was very much to address the needs of the industry. And it was a really sort of exciting time because they just found Eskay Creek in the northwest part of British Columbia, which is a very unusual, very small VMS deposit but extraordinary grades. So 2 ounces per ton of gold and vast amounts of silver and so on. And it was eventually mined as a gold-silver deposit, direct shipping of that material to the Horn smelter in eastern Canada. And so there was tremendous interest. The first project we had was working in that region around Eskay Creek, and we had 16 companies who wanted to support it, big majors, juniors, and so on, which was very challenging because the expectations of these companies were very different and so on. And yet, because there were so many, no company could really call the shots. So that kind of gave us a fair amount of freedom to pursue things of interest. And I had a wonderful group of students, masters, PhDs, and postdocs involved in that project. And I think we did some fantastic work in creating a framework, which is now changed and vastly better than them. But it was a great start. Then about the same time, there was the growing interest again in porphyries, and particularly the alkaline porphyries, which are the unusual suite of porphyries that are present in British Columbia. So again, we worked on those. But then as time went on, we gradually managed to spread our wings. So we kept the original supporters happy, the companies that we would be BC focused, but we got more involved in the Yukon, and then we got a little bit involved in Alaska, and then a little bit involved in Peru, and then a little bit involved in Chile, and with different students doing different projects. But we stayed Cordilleran focused, the length of the Cordillera really now. And so that was sort of governed the types of deposits that we were focused on. And we had some projects on geochemistry, on ore reserves. So we had some more applied projects as well, of these big regional projects and individual deposit-focused studies as well. So it grew dramatically. We managed to attract a lot of funding from industry, but also matching funding from British Columbia and from federal government in Canada. And the MDIU was established. And so I was contractual, which meant that knew that I wasn't going to stay forever because I wasn't a faculty and I wasn't a tenure position. And after 7 years, I got a chance to go work for Teck, and I took that chance and left the organization.
So before we talk about Teck, in terms of, I guess, some of the secrets to success with regards to the role in Vancouver, I guess part of that was your ability to bridge that gap between industry and academic research, or as some people might say, being that sort of boundary spanner or spanner of boundaries. I don't know. I mean, what was it that allowed you to do that? Was it because you'd actually worked on both sides, so therefore they both trusted you, or how did you make that work?
Unquestionably, it was because I came from industry. It made it far easier for me to come into the room and tell them about the projects we were doing and put it in their language, in their exploration context, and what it could mean for them and how it could help them. So yeah, that established trust from the beginning. And I knew some of these people already, so that helped obviously as well. So building on that trust and then delivering. And so I knew from an industry perspective, I knew that if I was on the other side, I'd expect results. So delivering and delivering continuously and making sure to the extent we could that there was a continuous stream of communication and discussion in addition to the formalized meetings and reporting and what have you. But it was the ongoing discussion that really, really helped. And that a lot of that happened, of course, in the field, because during the field programs, because again, it was the north, so intense 3 or 4 months in the field with helicopters and so on often. So we had to liaise very closely with the companies, and we're often staying in their camps or and so on. So it's continuous, non-stop communication. And the companies that benefited most from our work were the ones that were most engaged. But because we had big groups of companies, there was peer pressure as well. So the ones that were most engaged kind of pulled the others in as well. So there was just tremendous momentum in that period, and it made the job. It was a complicated job, but it was a relatively easy job in some ways to span that gap. What it was, spanner the gap.
So let's move on to Teck.
Yeah.
So why did you move, I guess, from this bridging role, shall we say, between industry and academia, then into, I guess, kind of one of Canada's largest mining companies?
Yeah. So attention span, time for a change.
Okay.
7 years I've been on the job with MDIU, contractual position, knowing that I think I had 2 more years to go on the contract. That was probably going to be the end anyway. So I was kind of ready for a move. And then, as I say, I got headhunted and went and I mean, looking back on it, it was very strange. I got invited to go and have lunch with the CEO, and he brought somebody else along. That CEO was Norman Keevil. Norman Keevil and his father founded Teck and built Teck. And Norman Keevil has a PhD in geophysics, so he's a person through his career has spanned academia and built companies and done deals. He's a consummate deal maker and so on, and just incredible person, sort of person I still look up to. So I had lunch with him, and it was supposed to be a very long process, and he offered me the job. And the next day I went in to see him and forgot to ask about how much he was going to pay me, because he immediately started showing me cross sections and rocks. So that was the end of that. So I went to work for Teck, sold completely. I didn't. I knew a lot about the companies I've been involved with, and of the companies I've been involved with, the 20 to 25 companies that I'd worked with, and in the role as for MDIU, Teck was one of the 3 or 4 companies that I already knew I would want to work for, because you get a sense of the people and the culture and their approach and so on. So it was a very easy decision to take. It was a tough decision to leave MDIU and to leave students, and I had left some students somewhat in the lurch, and I had to cover for them and so on and help them through, and I was able to do that. But it was a good decision.
So what was your role in Teck?
So I was chief geoscientist, which was a fantastic job. And talk about privilege. I didn't work for anybody really directly. I worked with people, particularly with the VP exploration, but I didn't really work for that person, and nobody worked for me. And so, and it was for me, it was a perfect role because I like working with people. And so how I got things done was by influencing them, not by telling them. And that was a great thing for my career, really, was to figure out how to do that and how to spend time with people. And I always, when I look back on it now, I say the time when I found out what was going on was driving for 4 hours in a truck with the geologist to the project site. And people, for some reason, really open up when they're driving in a truck. So by the time we got there, I'd have found out pretty much everything I needed to know about how well it was going, what the technical challenges were, what the interpersonal challenges, what the management challenges, what they thought of the company, and so on. I had all this information squirreled away in my head, and then got to work on the project. So I got to see all the projects, work on projects. I also was now on the other side of the fence. I was funding research, both in Canada, but also in Australia, the US, and other places as well. So it was a fantastic position, but it couldn't last that well. And so eventually the company realized that I was having too good a time, and then they assigned people to me. So then I had a group helping out, which was fine. They were great people and so on, but it wasn't quite as much fun as it had been. And then after 7 years, I did that for 7 years. There was a CEO change that happened in Teck. Norman Keevil stepped back, became chair, and Don Lindsay came in as the new CEO of Teck. And on arrival, pretty much, he offered me a position as to look at technology and innovation. So I became vice president of technology and development, business development. And that was totally amazing. It was frightening because I was suddenly dealing with research and technology development across metallurgy, mining, resources, reserves, environment, you name it. I had some 200 people I was responsible for in three different research units, plus business development kind of activities and new opportunities as well. So I learned more in the next 3 or 4 years than I'd learned in the previous 25. A super steep learning curve, great people. I discovered that metallurgists are really cool because actually they care about a lot of the same things as I cared about. And environmental people was super interesting because they cared about geochemistry and so on. So I just expanded my horizons. And also then I started looking at technology companies, new processing companies, new opportunities. And that took me into the startup world. So I ended up on the board of a startup company as well. So over that period of time, I just learned more and more and more until I realized I'd learned kind of enough at Teck, and there was nothing else that I really wanted to do at Teck. No, I had tremendous respect for the company. They've been incredibly good to me, but I just reached a plateau, attention span, whatever, and it was time to move.
So where did you go next?
Well, nowhere. No, I went to myself and I reached out to Anne and my partner and asked if I could join her company, which she'd actually put on the shelf for a few years earlier, because it was time for her to make a change. And she allowed me to join her company. So was my boss, and I was the person going out and doing consulting type activities. And then almost immediately, two things happened in short order right after that decision. My plan originally was to take a time out, do the right thing, take 6 months, plan my next move. That didn't happen. So literally, one of the first things I got asked to do was I got asked by a venture capital company to review a technology company who wanted to do ore sorting. And I looked at it and thought, this will take a day, and the answer would be no. I went for a week. I said, you've got to invest in this. And that company is MindSense that I'm still involved with. And so it's a fantastic, really hard, but great success story. And at about the same time, completely differently, Cornell University in upstate New York, 4 hours north of New York City, offered a position to look at some resource issues in the world, funded by a person called John Wold, WOLD, not world, as many people thought it was, but no, WOLD, had endowed this chair to look at resource issues and society and human interactions with the environment and resources and so on. And I knew Cornell, I knew some people there, so I thought I'd apply for that. So I applied and I got the job, which was a part-time job. So I spent 4 months there each year for the next 6 years and had 4 amazing students who are incredible people. And because wasn't there full time, I could only take students who were basically self-starters, and all 4 of these people did not need me. So it was a very good relationship.
So by this point in time, you've got a kind of almost a portfolio career going on, because you've got lots of different bits happening. Anne is your boss.
Yeah.
I mean, which is, of course, it was always going to happen.
Appropriate.
And so, did you enjoy any particular bit more than other bits, or did you feel there were gaps and you thought, oh, I want to get involved in other things?
Well, I'm endlessly interested in everything. So I'm always wanting to get involved in other things and trying to discipline myself to only take on things that A, I was really interested in, but B, I could do, and not get myself too strung out was a challenge. But I think I more or less got there. Anne might disagree on that point. um, so everything I got involved in, I loved, and it was more a question of trying to do them as well as I could, and not then dilute myself to the point that I couldn't do them as well as I could. And that was difficult. So it took me into all sorts of things. I ended up in 3 different startup companies, another company as a technical advisor. I was chair of Genome BC for a while because this was a genomic funding agency that was trying to fund research related to mining. And so they needed somebody who had been involved in mining. So I came onto their board and then spent a couple of years as their chair, which was ridiculous because I knew nothing about genomics, but learned again, sort of hit this. There wasn't even a learning curve, it was a learning cliff, and had to learn. And it's just amazing. I mean, I'm still not a genomic expert, even after spending time with them. So no, which was best? It's hard to say. I think the experience with MindSense was formative. Joining Cobalt, and which I did really to understand AI in the early days and so on, and the belief of the founders that they could do something fundamentally different, which turned out to be true, although it wasn't quite in the way that they thought it was when they started. That was an amazing experience as well. So no, and then most recently, I should add, one of the things that happened to me in that whole sequence of events was I got asked to be on a council of the World Economic Forum, because the person who ran that council had been at Teck, and she knew me and she invited me to join. And I sort of casually said, do you actually do anything? Being somewhat skeptical of all kind of organizations of this kind of ilk. And I got put in touch with the chair of the organization, a guy called Steve Desposito. And after half an hour with Steve, having asked him the same question, do you actually do anything? I realized he did a lot. So that was another great experience. Lasted for about 4 years. But then when that ended, I continued to work with Steve on a variety of issues. Steve ran a company called Resolve, which was trying to resolve issues between different industrial sectors and communities, governments, whatever, as their name might suggest. And as a result of working with Steve, we collectively spun out a company called Regeneration to attempt to reprocess waste and do restoration of legacy mine sites. And so that was another great experience, completely different, but so much to learn from looking at the challenges. And the challenges are policy, people, environment, as well as huge technical challenges to come to grips with.
So a lot of what we're talking about now, these are things that you're still involved with at the moment. Where are we going next? So what happens next for John Thompson?
So I'm not done. So what exactly happens? I'm trying to reorganize some of these things because I got to the point where some of them have been quite long term and I need to pull back from a few, and a few are reaching the point where that's a logical thing to do. So over the next year to 2 years, I hope to withdraw from 2 or 3 of the things that I'm currently involved in, and then selectively replace them with some other things. So there's a couple of things that I'm interested in right now, which are more project specific. So they would be fun just to be a little bit more hands-on on a couple of projects. But I'm still driven to do one more thing on the big picture, to solve another fundamental problem, to create something that can somehow address some of the big questions that we've been talking about here at this conference. What can we do? How can we find a way to really get to the nub of the problem? And I'm not going to be the person who's going to solve these problems. And I've never really been that person. I'm much better at pulling the pieces together, sort of seeing wood for trees, finding a way to get things going, and then starting the things. I'm not a finisher. I like to surround myself with other great people who are not as crazily optimistic as me, but are much more capable of delivering on opportunities. So I know that well enough that I'm not that person. So I want to pick that challenge and then make sure we can find the right kind of people to work it out. So I don't know what that is yet. So that's a work in progress.
Which is so exciting. Now, you mentioned some of the big problems, the big questions. Give us a selection of some of what those might be.
So there's big technical challenges around some of our ore deposits. I've been in with porphyry deposits, which are fascinating and very large and have supply a lot of the world's copper. But the one that really bugs me the most is what's called IOCG, iron oxide copper gold, because we truly don't understand them. Nobody really understands them. And that's a little unfair because the people who work on them day to day understand the actual mineralogy and the nature of them very well. And people like Kathy Ehrig in Australia knows Olympic Dam better than anybody in the world will ever know that deposit. So I don't belittle their work at all. But fundamentally, we don't know what drives these systems. And that's very dissatisfying to have these significant deposit type, and we can't actually explain how they happen or why they happen, where they happen, and so on. So I'd like to fix that.
Okay, so that's one.
That's one. So that's the one they very much on the geoscience end, and it'd be a big geoscience kind of question to sort that out. And then on the waste side, if we're going to deal with waste, mine waste, we have to deal with it completely and holistically, not just selectively take a few critical metals and minerals out of the waste, which would be a good thing. We still have to solve the waste problem. So solving the waste problem, there's two parts to that. One is the legacy problem. So can we reprocess that material in a way that creates benign material and find multiple uses for everything within it? So the full value kind of concept. That would be brilliant if we could do that. I'd love to do it, love to do that. And one of the key challenges there is dealing with the non-commercial minerals, i.e. pyrite or pyrrhotite, which cause all the problems in waste. So that's another one. And then I'm fascinated by the opportunity to work in the subsurface and do in-situ recovery or something close to that at least. And one of the reasons for that is it doesn't generate waste. So that's another way to solve the waste problem is don't produce it. Let's get to the heart of the matter. So if we could find a way to do that, so that means really understanding the subsurface in a new way, both structurally, mineralogically, geophysically, and then obviously with drill related data. If we're ever going to be able to do really deep underground mining, whether that's true physical mining or by leaching through in situ recovery, either way, we need to have a much deeper understanding. And again, I'm not going to develop an understanding of everything in the subsurface across the planet. So if I can make a little dent into that and help other people go down that track and do great things, that would be my goal. And the last thing I'd say is my last goal, which is I will continue to be involved in until I drop, is to help other people do these things, and particularly young people. So I love working with young people. I love their energy, their enthusiasm, their bright brains, their minds, and so on. I am not a person who thinks the current generation is useless. I think they are as better than my generation was, and anything I can do to help them is a good thing, whether it's an individual person, a little bit of mentoring, finding a connection, whatever it may be. That's my goal.
I think that's a brilliant place to finish our conversation. But thank you so much, John, and good luck with all those amazing goals.
Thank you very much.
So that was my conversation with John. And what stayed with me most is that throughout his career, he seems to have been driven less by job titles and more by interesting problems. Listening back, I was struck by how often John talked about learning about geology, laterites in Australia, learning how to bridge the gap between academia and industry, learning about metallurgy, technology, startups, even genomics. And it seems that every few years, he deliberately put himself in a position where he knew just enough to be useful, but not so much that he wasn't challenged. And there's something incredibly refreshing about that. Another thing that really stood out to me was John's self-awareness. Very early in his career, he realised that engineering wasn't for him. Later, he realised that a traditional academic career probably wasn't quite right either. And rather than forcing himself into a role that he didn't fit, he found ways to build a career around the things that genuinely energised him: variety, collaboration, problem solving, and bringing ideas together. That takes a degree of honesty with yourself that I think many of us can learn from. One of my favourite moments in the conversation comes towards the end, when John says that he doesn't really see himself as the person who finishes things. Instead, he sees himself as someone who brings people together, who spots opportunities, starts conversations, and helps create the conditions for others to succeed. I thought that was such a humble way of describing what has actually been an extraordinary career to date. Because when you look back, that's exactly what he's done. Whether it was bringing industry and academia together through collaborative research, helping new technologies find their way into mining, supporting young companies, or mentoring the next generation of geoscientists, there's a consistent thread running through it all, connecting people and ideas, and helping good things happen. I also found his optimism infectious. Despite all the challenges facing the raw materials sectors, from ore discovery and mine waste to new technologies and changing societal expectations, John still talks with genuine excitement about what's possible. Not because he thinks the answers are easy, but because he believes that there are talented people capable of solving them if we create the right environment and bring the right disciplines together. And perhaps that's what I took away most from our conversation, that none of us solves these challenges alone. Progress comes from collaboration, from trust, from sharing ideas, and from being willing to learn from people who think totally differently to us. Finally, I love the way John finished our conversation. After everything he's achieved throughout his career so far, the thing that still excites him most is helping the next generation succeed. There's something wonderfully optimistic about that, because perhaps the greatest legacy any of us can leave isn't simply the work we've done ourselves. It's the people we've encouraged, supported, and inspired along the way. And that, ultimately, is what Responsible Raw Materials is all about. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. Responsible Raw Materials brings together voices from across industry, academia, government, civil society, and beyond to explore shared challenges and opportunities regarding those raw materials we so often need at the beginning of our supply chains. If you enjoyed this conversation with John and would like to hear more, please feel free to go to www.responsiblerawmaterials.com to hear and see more of his thoughts shared through our annual and free-to-access global conferences.